Hello, everybody. So, time to have a look at the standards. In fact, I will keep you in suspense a little bit because the first presentation of mine would be about the structure and a little bit about the content, and I will take the standards at the end. It's true, there are 60 standards. I won't have time to show you all of them, but I will make a selection of 15. And first, I would like to talk a little bit about the audience of this document. And the main audience, this is a WHO document. It's directed to governments, the member states of WHO, and mainly ministries for health. That is the main audience, policy makers and program managers in the ministries. But there is also a secondary audience, which are all the other many stakeholders that are needed to come together to do this work, like service providers, professional organizations and user groups, etc. And I would imagine that you're listening to this here, that you belong to this second group, most of us. The vast majority of you belong to the second group. And it may be a secondary audience, but it's only secondary to the name because this group is as important as the first one. And I hope that you will feel after this presentation that you want to contribute and be stakeholders in the implementation of these standards. So the purpose of the document is to help countries to develop and/or strengthen services that are affordable, accessible, effective, efficient, safe, and of high quality. But the aim, as you've already heard from Alakos and Chapal, is also to support the implementation of the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Sustainable Development Goals, and universal health coverage. Oh, sorry. I need to have my laptop here because my glasses doesn't work on that distance. So, as you've already understood, I think, this document consists of two parts. Part one, which is the actual standards document, and part two, which is an implementation manual. The first part has then 60 global standards, and it's important to stress that they're global standards. They're not intended for a specific world region or low and middle-income countries, even though the problems may be the greatest in those countries. You see the same problems also in high-income countries. There are big groups or pockets of populations, also in high-income countries, who don't have access to these services. Part two is the implementation manual, and that's intended as a tool to help countries to discuss these issues. It gives ideas on what has to be done, why it should be done, how it should be done, by whom, and when. It sounds very ambitious. Of course, the answers to these questions can't be provided in this document to the extent we would like to see it there, but it gives an idea of discussions on how to analyze the country situations and to arrive at priorities for the countries. Now, I would like to look a little bit closer at part 1 to start with, the standards document and the content. We have an introduction, and briefly it defines what prosthesis and orthosis, prosthetics and orthotic services are. It talks about the users, who the users are. It stresses the fact that many users need these services for their lifetime, with regular renewals of devices and repair of devices, maintenance of devices. It's not a one-off treatment. The document presents some of the benefits, and the social benefits. First of all, that of course these devices lead to improved mobility, function, and that in turn increases independence. And it also contributes to social inclusion. But those are not the only benefits. There are also very important economic benefits. As many people, many users can return to work, they can go to school, they can earn an income, they're not so dependent on assistance anymore, not so dependent on health care. So prosthetics and orthotic services should not be seen as it has traditionally been seen, as an expense. It is rather an investment that generates a return. This is further developed in the chapters of the documents. Chapal mentioned the figure of 0.5%. We mentioned it in the document, which corresponds to 35 to 40 million people in the world. And it is definitely a figure that will grow with growing populations and growing proportions of elderly. And the document estimates that only 10% of the need is met. Now, these are estimates, 0.5%, 10%, and later in the document you will see that more precise figures are needed, and countries are encouraged to find those figures. The introduction also tells a little bit about the challenges, that there is lack of understanding, more importantly, many times at policy level, of what these services are, what are the benefits, what's the role of these services. There is lack of funding, there are costs are comparatively high on these services, etc. And as Alak has already pointed out, the multidisciplinary or multi-sectoral work is stressed in the document, and also the important role of or linkage to health. We have already seen the 4 chapters: policy, products, personnel, provision. That is the 4 Ps. Should be mentioned somewhere. Yeah. And if we look at the 4 chapters, in part 1, they also have 4 subsections. So it's a kind of 4x4 structure. So the policy chapter has subsections on leadership and governance, financing of services, information on services, and promotion of services. The product chapter talks about the types of products, supply of components and materials, technical standards, and research and development. And the personnel chapter talks about, introduces to the different personnel needed, the training needed, workforce planning, professional regulation and recognition. And then the final chapter talks first of all about user-centered services, stresses that the importance of that. And then it looks at service delivery from three perspectives, starting with the macro perspective, looking at systems that are needed, national systems, then zooming in on the service unit and the standards that are required there, and zooming in furthermore on the processes that need to be in place in the service unit. And if we look at the headings and subheadings here, we will find the six health system strengthening building blocks that were mentioned earlier, with slightly different names since we're using the P's in the headings. But they're all there, the six. And that was actually the starting point for the layout of the document. Now, part 1 and part 2, how do they relate? Well, in part 1, we have 60 standards. In part 2, 58 different topics, specific topics are discussed. And every topic, the topics can vary from 1 or 2 paragraphs only for one topic up to 2 or 3 pages for one topic. And if we look at them individually, the standards, every standard has a reference given to a topic discussed in the manual. At least one, sometimes 2 or 3 even. While the topics, some of the topics do not have a link to the standards. It's from the time when we had nearly 200 standards. We decided to divide it by 2 first and then reduced it another 40%. Some of the topics that were discussed, or some of the topics at that time, were linked to a standard. We took out the standard, but the topic is still there, and we think it's important to have it there because it's important for the overall planning and discussions. Now, I want to give you some examples of such topics that are discussed in the part 2 then. I still haven't come to the standards, but I will get there. So, some of those examples, if we look at the policy chapter, for instance, in part 2 then, it presents the stakeholders and their different roles. It provides some ideas of the guiding framework, as we call it in the document, that is needed. That is the legislation, the policies, the strategic plans, etc., that are needed to guide services. It talks about costs, identifies 5 cost areas for service provision. It talks about economic benefits, as I mentioned earlier. It talks about collection of data, how to do that, and the need for it. And then there are another 13 topics discussed in that chapter. In the products chapter, appropriate technology is discussed, how to evaluate that, products features, basic, intermediate, and advanced product features are discussed, prefabricated, custom-made products, and priority-assisted products, as Chapal talked about and then another 6 topics in that chapter. For the personnel chapter, it discusses the core personnel needed, the prosthetics, orthotics personnel, and then other professionals involved in prosthetics and orthotics service provision, and the multidisciplinary approach. And it talks about training of personnel that may be the core personnel and also other professionals. And then another 8 topics in that chapter. And the last chapter on provision talks about user policy, the importance that, I will come to that standard later, and the central role of the user in planning and service provision. It talks about inclusion in the health sector, as Japal also mentioned earlier, and it talks about different service delivery systems. Finally, I will present some of the standards, and I will take 2 or 3 under each heading or subheading. And you will be able to read them, but I will also have to read them because of the translation, so that the message goes through to the French listeners or French-speaking listeners. So, as examples, standard number 1 reads that governments should assume a leading role in the development and coordination of national prosthetics and orthotic service provision. This is an obligation of governments to do that. And they don't have to do the work by themselves, but they should have a leading role, and they may delegate tasks to other stakeholders. Standard number 2 reads that government should involve all relevant stakeholders, including service users, caregivers, and user groups, in policy development, planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluating prosthetics and orthotic services. As I said initially, this is not a job or a task that governments can take on alone. There are a number of stakeholders that need to be involved, and this needs to be coordinated then. So those are examples under leadership and governance. And if we continue to financing, we'll have 3 examples there. The first one, that the cost of providing prosthetics and orthotic services should be assessed periodically. That's surely already the case in private services. You need to know the costs to be able to calculate your profit. But it may not be the case in NGO-provided services or public services. And it's rarely done at national level. That's also an interesting thing to know. How much is the cost of service provision if it would be provided to the whole population? Correspondingly, the direct and indirect economic benefits of prosthetics and orthotic services should be analyzed at individual, family, community, society, health sector, and national levels. This is a daunting task for any country, but we still want to have it as a standard here because it's so important. And we hope that this can be done by countries together with international support, because it would be very, very important to know the economic benefits, to get an understanding of that and to be able to compare that with the costs. And the last one, number 12, prosthetics and orthotic services should be included in national health and social insurance systems like other health interventions. Prosthetics and orthotic services shouldn't be an exception. If they are health services, they should be under the health insurance. Now, the problem may be that health insurances don't exist or are not effective in all countries. It's already a problem there. But it would mean a lot to prosthetics and orthotic services if they could be included. And then under the heading of information, as already mentioned by Chapal, I think, that data on prosthetics and orthotic service provision should be collected periodically, analyzed at service level, and shared at national level. And that one, together with the next one, number 14, a national prosthetics and orthotics database should be established to identify total need, types of need, and unmet need. It's important to have this information to understand how big is the challenge. Few countries know this, if any. Under the products heading, number 17, a national list of priority prosthetics and orthotics products should be drawn up, respected, and updated regularly. Also something that Chapal mentioned before. Then a long one, components, materials, consumables, tools, machines, and other equipment used exclusively for fabrication of prosthetics and orthotic products that are not available in a country should be exempt from import duty and customs fees. This could also make a dramatic changes because these fees, they drive up the prices of products in countries. Yes, I'm getting close to the end. I will just read the last ones to speed up a little bit. Under personnel, number 28, training in prosthetics and orthotics should be available at various levels to fully meet national needs. Number 34, prosthetics and orthotics clinicians should be regulated by the state within regulations for health professionals. That has already been mentioned. And finally, on provision, a documented policy to safeguard the rights of users of prosthetics and orthotic services should be in place and in effect outlining the features of user-centered services. This is at service level then. And number 38, service users and their representatives should be involved in policy making, planning, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating prosthetics and orthotic services. Take part in decision making at all levels and be represented on relevant committees. This was hinted already in the second standard. Number 41, prosthetics and orthotic services should be part of the health sector or be closely linked to it. And number 42, finally. Prosthetics and orthotics services should be delivered in a 3-tier system at primary, secondary, and tertiary levels with established links and two-way pathways for referral and follow-up. This refers to the pyramid figure that was shown before by Chapal and maybe by Alakos too. So, to just come to the end of this presentation, the way forward, how do we look at this? Well, the starting point would be to audit the situation in countries and compare the systems and services that are in place with the standards that we present in the document, to establish a baseline that can be measured against later on. And then to identify priorities for action, and this will vary a lot between countries. What are the priorities they would set, depending on context and resources available, etc. And prepare a plan with benchmarks for implementation, and then to conduct evaluations to understand how the implementation is going. And then the very last slide here, just what does it mean then, implementation of standards? And to put it very simply, if the standard says that governments should assume a leading role, etc., well, if governments do that, if they assume that leading role, then the standard has been met. And if we look at number 2, the standard number 2, governments should involve all relevant stakeholders. Well, if they take on that leading role, it will be, and they are committed to the task, they could surely also involve all relevant stakeholders. This is the simplified version, as you understand now. And if they have come that far, standard number 3 would also be within reach for them to establish a prosthetics and orthotics committee where coordination of this work between the stakeholders can take place. And then number 4, within that committee, they can develop a national guiding framework, the policies and plans, as I mentioned earlier. Well, that's the first standards happen to have a logical flow. But if it would be that the governments, they don't take on that leading role, then that will be the case in many countries. It won't come automatically. Well, then awareness raising may be needed, because there may not be enough awareness about these issues at policy level. And the number 15, the standard number 15 says that strategies for awareness should be established. Okay, let's establish awareness raising strategies, but for that, we also need data on the need. That's another standard, or 2 standards, 13 and 14. And we need to know the costs, and we need to know the benefits, and we need to know the impact of this. The impact is not mentioned as a standard here, but it's discussed in the implementation manual. This is the ideal scenario, but I just want to make the point that these standards, they are interlinked. So if you work on certain standards, it will be easier to implement other standards. They come together as a package, 60 standards. And I don't say it will be easy. It's not an easy task. But what we hope is that when you use this document, it will be easier, and we hope that you will be committed to participate as stakeholders in this challenging task that lies ahead of us. Thank you very much.